Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Good News York. My name is Noah Chrysler. Today we are here with Michelle D. Shenandoah. Hi, Michelle.
Hello. Hi.
Michelle is a Syracuse-based founder, storyteller, and educator. She's built a platform that uplifts indigenous women's voices and brings Haudenosaunee knowledge to public conversation through community work, education, and public media. She's the founder of Rematriation, host of the PBS series Rematriation Voices with Michelle Schenandoah. How's it going?
It's going really well. Yeah.
Wonderful.
It's going great today.
Wonderful. Michelle, in your own words, can you please introduce yourself and kind of tell us what you do?
Yeah. Siguli Sugweg, Galuhianuas Neogets. My name is Michelle Schenandoah. I am called in my culture by my people Galuhianuas, which means that she's fond of the sky. I am a member of the Oneida Nation Wolf Clan. And I am the founder of Rematriation, a nonprofit organization based here in Syracuse. And we have, we're just now actually celebrating our 10th year at putting this work out into the world. Yeah.
Wonderful. Your name there, was that given at birth, or is that something that you choose? What is the process? That was very interesting. Can you tell me more about that?
Yeah. So within our way, we receive a name, and it's not actually given to you at birth. It's given a little bit later on, and it can vary, in age. But generally, when you are either a baby or you're young, you can change them as you get older. But it's given to you from your clan family. And so only one person can hold that name while they're alive, and then it kind of goes back into, a collection of names that can be drawn from in the future for others to carry on that name. Yeah.
Very cool. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Cool. What is rematriation? What is rematriation, and can you tell us more about it?
Yeah. So rematriation actually has its roots in indigenous midwifery. And so rematriation now, if you look out into the world, you look at on the internet, you can find it in quite a few places. It's growing. It's a movement. And but when it first started really emerging and being used, it was within our community. And one of our clan mothers, who we call Mama Bear, who we'll probably talk about today, she was starting to use this in a new context in relation to items that were being returned from museums back to our people. And then with her being a person, within the political sphere of the Haudenosaunee, was also starting to use it in other contexts in relation to our governance. And so now you can see rematriation has moved in the spaces of, food sovereignty, cultural revitalization. It's in governance. It's still within this process of what people would sometimes call repatriation. So I worked with Mama Bear to create a definition from our Haudenosaunee women's perspective, and we came up with returning the sacred to the mother. And it really creates an opportunity for others to be able to live into it as a practice, as a movement. And so mother as in Mother Earth, as in mothers, as in, the mother tongue, the mother language that we all learn, looking at, language revitalization, looking at, seed, heirloom seeds of our people and using those to feed our people, centered around food sovereignty. So it really can grow in context. And so Rematriation as our organization is helping to uplift all of that movement and telling the stories. So turning the cameras on, turning on, the audio, and, being able to share that out and really helping the movement to grow.
Very cool. Can we zoom in on certain aspects of that? So particularly around like food. Can you tell me more about let's zoom in there, right? Because I think that's everybody understands food to a certain extent. But so when you talk about, you used a certain phrase that I don't exactly remember, but basically, can you tell me more about like this idea of food?
Food sovereignty.
Food sovereignty was the term. Yeah, tell me about that.
Well, so being here in Syracuse, I will say, it's important for folks to know, which I think most people here in Syracuse know, that the Oneida Nation is located directly south of Syracuse. And so, when you look at food sovereignty, I'm going to, bring up one of the community members there. Her name is Angela Ferguson. And so she does a lot centered around food sovereignty as part of a bigger movement that's happening across Turtle Island. And that's what we call North America. And so Angela has been very much invested in really helping to create a connection between the original seeds of people from across the Americas with seeds that they have not had for, who knows, generations, hundreds of years. And so it, in a collection of seeds that, she had come to become a caretaker for, included all these seeds from people that even some who the people aren't even here anymore.
Wow.
Right? So imagine, think about it this way. Imagine wherever you're from, your homelands, and think about seeds that were cultivated and cared for by your ancestors, your great grandmothers, right? And then there was something happened, and then you were separated from those original foods. And so, coming back to them and being able to grow them in your own soil, in your homeland, and to eat those foods that your ancestors ate, that's kind of really a part of food sovereignty, or at least with the work that she's been doing. But it is those original seeds. It is those foods that your ancestors ate, and it speaks to your DNA, right? So, and it speaks to the soil from where those seeds are from, because they've learned how to adapt to the conditions of that land, right? You can take seeds from here and try to plant them somewhere else in the world, and they may not, grow from there, because it doesn't speak the same language in nature, right? So, and it's, also related to our bodies. When you think about, there's, different things related to epigenetics, or I'm trying to remember all those fancy names for those diets, right? Where you
Sure.
eat your ancestral diet, and it speaks to your body. And that's basically, what that is. And to be able to feed your own people with your original foods. So, yeah.
No, I think that is a very fascinating concept, especially with all of the, processed foods that we eat nowadays, and all of the mass grown plants and things that come out of these factory farms and that sort of things.
Seeds that actually are created today that do not reproduce. So if you were to save the seeds from certain foods that we buy from the grocery store today, a lot of them will not reproduce. They will not grow, because it's forcing people to have to go buy seeds from a company to produce foods that are, grown one time. And then so the cycle continues. But imagine seeds that, do what seeds are supposed to do, right? And so, that really is rematriation, helping to, preserve and cultivate those original seeds that our people from all around the world, have been planting since time immemorial.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
And rematriation, so basically that's one example, that's a zoomed in example, but
Yeah.
rematriation is basically doing all of that with basically all aspects of indigenous culture. Is that correct?
Essentially, in a way, yeah. Because when you think about language, original languages, speaks to something ancestrally to you, and with your cultural practices as well, right? So for anyone, if you find that, you trace that lineage and those roots back to your homelands and those original songs and practices and language, it's really going to speak to your spirit. Your soul is going to feel that. And so, essentially, yeah, that's what it is. But I think even on a bigger level is taking that even a step further and thinking about our relationship with the earth, right? Because that's something that all humans had at one point, right? Is that real deep connection with the understanding that, this is how we live. This is what allows us to live. So being able to be in relationship with the earth, with Mother Earth, because right now she really truly is pushing on everybody to say, hey, you have to change how you're doing what you're doing, especially if you want to survive, or you want to make sure that your future generations of your grandkids' will be able to survive. And so that's why we do what we do at Rematriation, is to tell those stories, to give pathways and shape, new, ways of thinking by all people, with bringing in that indigenous knowledge that has always thought that way, thinking about 7 generations into the future.
Wow.
Yeah.
From that specific lens, what are some of the ways that you see Mother Earth objecting to what's currently going on?
I think we all can see it,
Yeah.
right? From climate change to, there's just the local level, we can feel that in the differences, and from the weather patterns to then how that can be devastating, right? To how we live our lives, and, the safety of our own homes and our communities, right? So I think we can all acknowledge that, to species, that are disappearing or that are struggling to be able to live in their natural habitats, right? To the air that we breathe, right? Like, is it clean? Is it pure? Is the water that we drink, is that clean and is that pure? And will it be able to sustain, some level of purity that future generations will be able to drink the water or to breathe the air and be healthy, right? I think that's the important thing. Yeah.
Absolutely. No, that is absolutely fascinating. We should probably get back on track, because I know I sent you these questions before. But no, that's very fascinating. And as someone who, hopes to have children someday, I think about those things all the time, right?
Yeah.
It's like, so I want to bring future generations into this world when they might not have clean water to drink, or, that is a very top of mind relevant conversation to have. So.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Cool. Will there be another season of Rematriation Voices on PBS?
Well, let's talk about the first season of Rematriation Voices.
Sounds great. Let's do it.
Yeah. So this first season that has been released was aired on our local PBS station, WCNY. And so folks can actually go and access the episodes now by, typing in Rematriation Voices, WCNY. They'll pop up. There's 5 episodes that are there. And it really takes people through a landscape of Haudenosaunee and indigenous perspectives, and also coupled with work that allies are doing alongside us to also be able to uplift this important knowledge. And so those 5 episodes are there. They, center around different components of history or of cultural teaching, also looking at the roots of the U.S. Constitution, which are indigenous and actually come from right here in hometown Syracuse for folks who are from here. Like, people don't recognize that this is the birthplace of modern democracy. Like, that should be mind-blowing for some who've never heard that before.
Yeah.
Right? Like, what does that mean, really? And so, okay, so if the roots of the Constitution are indigenous, what did we miss out on? What was maybe left out? Why is it not working today? What are maybe some things that we can learn and bring into the space of today? And that's what we explore in Rematriation Voices, in an episode that's called Hidden Roots of Democracy. We have another episode that's called Eve Meets Sky Woman. And that is focused in on the Haudenosaunee influence on women's suffrage, on the early suffragists, and again taking a look at what was left out, or taking a look at 2 of the origin stories of Eve, of the story of Adam and Eve, and then comparing that and contrasting that to the story of Sky Woman, which is the origin creation story for the Haudenosaunee. And so it's really beautiful. It also has one of our clan mothers in there, Mama Bear, who's in a few of the episodes. And also the late Dr. Sally Roche Wagner, who was a really good friend to the Haudenosaunee and was one of the very first scholars to actually write about the Haudenosaunee influence on women's suffrage. So that is, part of what people can see in there. And then in addition to an episode about Matrilineal Men and what is it like for men to grow up in a matrilineal culture. And it's probably surprising for most, because you have these men who are just, really strong and grounded in who they are, who are chiefs and, they're leaders of our nations, and people might not expect that, right? And so, yeah, I really encourage folks to check out those episodes. But let's go back to your original question, because you'll have to remind me what it was.
You're fine. So with the next season, will there be a next season? And
So I would love for us to have a season 2. Yes. So I'm thinking about it, and right now we're still in the process of really getting season 1 out there into the world. And so actually, this coming Tuesday, March 31st, we are hosting a public event at the WCNY studios in downtown. And so there's tickets are selling out really fast. There is a capacity, so I would encourage folks to take a look on Eventbrite. And so if you go to eventbrite.com and you put in Rematriation Voices, you can get a ticket to come. It's next week. And so there we're going to be exploring this new screening series. It's like a campaign that we're putting out into the world and asking folks to join us by creating their own DIY hosting. And so this will give people an opportunity to be able to screen an episode or all 5 of the episodes, whatever is their comfort level. And they can do this in their home with a few other friends. They can do it in a community setting, whether it's a community organization, a congregation, or if you're a teacher and you want to bring it into your classroom. There's, it's really kind of at the level each person, is interested in participating. But we'd like to get folks to do a screening, and then we're going to provide everyone with a hosting kit. Okay. And that will kind of help them to facilitate and walk them through a screening, but then also to be able to have a meaningful dialogue after the event and to be able to talk about it, right? Because there's so much content in there that folks say, I never knew this. Like, what do I do with this information now? So it gives people an opportunity to talk together about it. And that's one thing that we find is of really great value of, what we're creating. And I don't mean value in monetary, perspective, but value in terms of how it can enrich our lives.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Of the episodes that you've released, which episode do you think is one of the more important ones for the current cultural conversation?
Oh, that's really hard to answer. So the reason that it's difficult to answer, I think it really depends on where people's perspective is, right? I mean, there's, such a diverse community here in Syracuse, but even just in general, like human beings, we all have different interests. So, for instance, Hidden Roots of Democracy is focused in on, the U.S. governance, on democracy, what was left out, then the Eve, and Scott Meets Sky Woman, focused in on women's suffrage. Then we have another one that's called First Environment, and, that is one of our indigenous midwives, who's an elder, Gudgie Cook, and Robin Wall Kimmerer, who some of you may know. She is not only a professor at SUNY ESF, she is Potawatomi, but she's also a New York Times bestseller of the book Braiding Sweetgrass that a lot of people love. So she brings science together, and the two of them talk about like our relationship with Mother Earth, right? So then we have another one that's centered on, the Doctrine of Discovery, and it's taking a look at how this Doctrine of Discovery has embedded in U.S. law and even in Canadian law, and what are the impacts upon Indigenous people today, and how has that caused an erasure of Indigenous history, culture, and identity over the last 500 plus years in the Americas. And so what are those impacts today, and what are Indigenous women and allies doing about that, right? So there's, it really just kind of depends on where somebody would like to jump in. But given that this country is now celebrating its 250th year of, declaring independence, the Hidden Roots of Democracy could be a good place to start. Yeah.
Cool. That actually is a great segue into my next question, which is why do you think these perspectives have been left out of the mainstream conversation so much, right?
Yeah.
What do you think led to that happening?
Well, okay, so I really love looking at, systems and, what's sort of like the root cause. And so the Doctrine of Discovery, which I have just mentioned, was created by the Vatican. It's a series of papal bulls that, began to be called this Doctrine of Discovery. And what it really is, essentially, is it's what gave the legal right to early European explorers like Columbus and all those who came over here to put their flag into the soil and claim the land and the resources in the name of the crowns of Europe. And with that, it was basically stating that the indigenous people, were not Christians, and therefore, were basically of the flora and fauna, without having a soul. And so, therefore, the European explorers could do whatever they liked with, removing indigenous peoples from the land. So that essentially has led to genocide over, the last 500 years. No, but what's interesting is that has made its way into U.S. law, which is still valid law to this day. So when you look at early case law, the United States used the Doctrine of Discovery to claim all the lands in its, that it ever, acquired or took or however it came into land. And then you see it again in 2005. In a case against the Oneidas, against my nation. And it was cited by Ruth Bader Ginsburg, of all things, right? So it really has some really devastating effects because when you think about it, law really shapes policy. And policy shapes education and curriculum. And education then shapes how we get to know one another and how we treat one another and what we value. And so if you think about it, if the Doctrine of Discovery is embedded in the law, right, which invisibilizes and erases indigenous people from the land, and it's still valid to this day, like all the way up to 2005, you see it still continuing to exist. It's still on the books. So that really, right there, if you look at root cause, kind of explains why there is an invisibilization and lack of indigenous history in curriculums or even understanding of people today that exist.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
What do you think changes when those things that have been made invisible, when they're not invisible, when they're reintroduced to the conversation?
Well, I will say that what I have discovered for folks who, come to learn about indigenous histories, people, value, thinking, and being able to even apply it in today, what I always see is that there is a deeper understanding and an appreciation, number one, for the people, but also this other thing that happens where people say, I didn't know this. I never knew this. Why did I not know this? Why was this never taught to me in school, right? So I always find that to be such a moment. But then when people who have developed relationship or gotten closer to, these teachings and understandings, they have much more of a heart opening, right? To say, wow, this has so much meaning to it that I can bring even to my own life. Yeah.
Absolutely. From my own experience, I was educated locally. I went to middle school, high school, very close to here, and I think they did a great job, honestly, of educating us about indigenous peoples and indigenous values. And I don't know, but as I've talked to more people who went to different high schools and different districts and things, I also have realized that this was not the things that we were taught were not taught to everybody. So I don't know. I hear what you're saying.
Yeah, it might have a lot to do with who your teacher was, right? Because I think each teacher gets to decide for themselves, how they're going to teach, this curriculum, and usually it's taught in the 4th grade.
Yep.
And so if you have somebody who may, perhaps have been more connected to one of our nations and spent time studying the history will invest more time teaching the kids. But I also like to ask people, like, what do you remember from the fourth grade?
Yeah.
Right? And how does that become relevant to understanding your political landscape that you live in today, right? Or legal landscape that you live in today. And so, I just like to think about, when we think about all the voices at the table, right? So who have been the primary, voices at the table, and how could it be different, perhaps, if there were more, perspectives to really think about, how we live in relation to the land or each other.
Absolutely. I mean, I have personal answers to those questions, but I don't know. Mrs. Brady did a pretty good job. Mrs. Wanovich did a pretty good job, I think. We learned we learned about like the Longhouse. We learned about, I remember we were, told about things like Manifest Destiny and the that one image. I don't know if you know the name of that painting, but how it was basically essentially like propaganda that was early, an early form of propaganda.
I like your teachers.
Yeah, they're pretty cool. They're pretty cool people. Cool. Okay, in your 10 years of doing this, what are some things that you've learned, which we've talked a lot about? So maybe, how about any stories that you've got from these last 10 years of doing this? Anything stand out?
Yeah. Well, I think I've kind of touched upon it just a little bit, but, let's put it this way. When I was growing up, I, grew up within our traditional homelands and our territory. I have family who is leadership, grew up within our traditional culture. And so that's what I learned, right? That's like the foundation of how I understood myself to be in the world. And so, then I go off to school and it's kind of a bit of a different reality every day. Okay, it's fine, going through this. And then 7th grade, I remember getting a very big, thick U.S. history textbook. And I was like, oh, great. Okay. Well, now we're going to get to hear stories about, how the Haudenosaunee interacted with Ben Franklin and, George Washington and, what were those exchanges? And none of that was in there for starters. But I do remember at some point, I got excited because I was like, oh, okay, yay. Or now we're going to learn about, natives in U.S. history. And it literally was just a page, a front and a back page. There's black and white photos and this idea of, disappearing indigenous people. And it said nothing about Haudenosaunee people. And, I'm sure it probably talked about the Lakota Nation, but I'm sure it referred to them as the Sioux Indians, right? More than anything. If it said it, I don't remember because it was a while. It was a few years ago.
Sure. Yeah. I can imagine.
But I remember that was it. And I was like thinking to myself, that was so disappointing because here I was sitting in a classroom of, all other non-native students, and they missed out on the opportunity to learn something that could have been super impactful to their understanding of even just being in relation to Haudenosaunee people, to the Oneida people who they interacted with on a daily basis, and they didn't have the opportunity to learn this history, right? So, I flash forward, and I went to Cornell. I was at an Ivy League institute, and here I am, and again, I'm sitting in a U.S. history class, and for whatever reason, the day that we were covering the U.S. Constitution, we had a guest lecturer who was also a professor at Cornell and talked about all these great things about the founding fathers and da-da-da. And then, at the very end of the class says, oh, yes, okay, and let's talk about blacks and Indians. And said some really horrible things and just, quickly wrapped it all up. And, well, why do Indians get reservations and why can they, sell cigarettes, whatever. I can't remember what he said. And he says, oh, because they were shooting arrows at us. And so we had to give them something. Wow. Right. And I'm at Cornell University. Right. And I thought, wow, so myself and a lot of other students in the class were like, pretty incensed at some of the things that he said, and about, other, people and how the Constitution was created. So at the end of the class, everybody went down to talk to him. And he said, no, I'm not doing this. I know what this is, like as if somehow he's, being pinned in a corner to look like the bad guy or something. And he left, and I thought, wow, like that's it. There was no opportunity for conversation, dialogue, decompress, like what just happened. So, flash forward, I go to law school. I went to New York Law School. I have 2 law degrees. And, in that process, I had to create my own form of study because there wasn't anything centered around, indigenous, law I had to create it on my own for myself. So, it's of no surprise that most people, U.S. citizens in this country don't really have this history, right? And in law school, I remember studying the Johnson v. McIntosh case that has the Doctrine of Discovery in it. And sitting in that class, and the conversation as the professor, tried to introduce this concept, the conversation just kind of quickly, just fell into this really awful place where all of a sudden students in the classroom are talking about, did the Indians teach the white people to scalp, or did the white people teach the Indians to scalp? And I just watched this unfolding, and I thought, wow, I'm in law school.
Wow.
And this is the same case that, Harvard students or Stanford students or whatever law school you're from, this is the case that all students are introduced to. And this is what happened in my law school. No different, right? So I thought, wow, this is just crazy. It's very perplexing. And so, well, I thought it was then, but, as I've spent time, continuing to just kind of pull apart like what's happening here and understand how this doctrine of discovery really impacts people, I can understand why those attitudes have been shaped, right? So now with the work that, we do at Rematriation, I've encountered so many people who are just really grateful because they're now learning pieces of history that help them to have like these aha moments to say, oh, that makes sense. I can see that, and I really appreciate what is being shared with me, and I want to learn more. I want to know more. People have attended our events, and, people have like been in tears and said, my life really feels changed. Like I feel now like something has clicked for me. And, I'm more hopeful, and, what can we do to change this? How can we set something new? And I feel like that's what continues to drive me at Rematriation. It's like the more that, we can share with the public, for folks to say, well, what can we do to change? Well, you change the laws. You can change what's taught in your classroom. You can change, different dynamics in how we manufacture or how we have a relationship with the earth, right? It can be at a very granular level or at a much bigger, level as well.
Awesome. Yeah, that is a shocking. Those are shocking stories to sit in Cornell in a Cornell classroom and hear your professor like kind of boil things down to something so blunt and like low resolution. I think the term that was in my brain as I was listening to your response is like low resolution, right? That is a characterization, like or a mischaracterization of reality. I feel like, and I think that it's really powerful that I think that in order to actually create change, there's probably a lot of work that needs to be done. And so the fact that you are creating these educational materials around these things, that is work, that is hard work to do, right? And instead of, squabbling with people, instead saying, hey, if you are open to learning, here are some interesting things that you can learn. I think that that's a very powerful way to help affect change.
Yeah, absolutely. And now, I will say what I think, some of the changes that I see happening, and I definitely encourage, continued support is, I love hearing the story about your teachers, who I'm sure might be engaged with different community groups. Like I know here in Syracuse, there's the Neighbors of the Oneida Nation, which, develops a relationship on a continual basis, with the Onondaga Nation and helping to bring those values here into the city of Syracuse. So the values and teachings on history, Cornell and many other, institutions are bringing more Indigenous professors, as faculty to be able to sort of be in a space to teach these histories and contemporary issues. And I think it's always great to hear firsthand from the people. Because it's very, very different, right? That's not to say that people can't teach the history. Certainly they can. But I think that's what Rematriative Voices does, is it brings you into conversation to be in a space firsthand with hearing from leaders and scholars who are in the space of sharing this information. So it creates kind of a unique opportunity for people who are watching or listening to Rematriative Voices, because it's also on podcast version.
Love it.
I just had to say that. But it allows you to hear perspectives you would maybe not normally hear in your everyday life.
Absolutely. Really quick, I have to say also, Miss LaRose, she did a great job. Now Mrs. Stevens, thank you, Miss LaRose. She did awesome. And then also I think scouting also helped a lot. I was in Boy Scouts, and so, we were always at national parks and going to museums and things and learning about the history of the land and everything. So that I think also had an impact on me. I think that my last question we kind of covered. So I don't know. Michelle, thank you very much. This was a fantastic conversation. Anything that you want to plug, anything that we did not talk about that you want to talk about?
Well, I definitely say, come to our event on the 31st. If you can't make it, check out the series online, but also make sure to visit us at rematriation.org. And so rematriation.org. A lot of folks are like, how do you spell that? So think about the word repatriation, take out the P for the patriarchy, and you put in the matrilineality with the M. So rematriation. We'll also have rematriativevoices.org up very soon. And there folks can learn about how to also be supportive of the work. So we're a charitable 501c3, so people can make tax-deductible contributions to help support our work. And we really are looking to create a season 2. So those contributions definitely really help in terms of, putting this media out that we put out for free for the public. And so we encourage folks to definitely please come watch the materials and engage with them and with our organization. So thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. This is Good News York. My name is Noah Chrysler. Thanks so much for watching. Have a great day.